Hello, everybody. I'm Jeannie Talbot. I'm from the San Diego region, and welcome to today's presentation by the JASNA region from Oregon and Southwest Washington. I'm here today with Arnie Perlstein, who's going to be our speaker for this presentation today. I hope you're all in the right spot because this is what we're talking about today. I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Arnie Perlstein. Arnie is an independent literary scholar and retired attorney living in Portland, Oregon, and is a father in a Brady Bunch with 5 children altogether and 2 grandsons. He is also a confessed die-hard Austen obsessive. He was first exposed to Austen by his wife Jackie at the relatively late age of 42 in 1995 via all the film adaptations, then began reading the novels, then began talking about Austen online. For the past 20 years, including being a member of JASNA since 2005, Arnie has been delving in a scholarly way into the mysteries of what he calls Jane Austen's shadow stories. He has spoken 3 times at JASNA AGM breakout sessions, several times more at local JASNA meetings, as well as giving talks in England in 2007 and 2009. If he doesn't surprise you with at least 3 things he says today, you're not listening. So I'm going to let Arnie take it away. I'm going to take that screen off, and Arnie, welcome.
Thank you, Jeannie, very much. And thank you everyone for coming today. This is going to be fun, I'm sure. Now, as you know, but one not fun note that, as many of you realize, Marcia Hamley, my colleague here in the JASNA chapter here in Portland, has had a medical issue come up, which prevents her from presenting today along with me as we had planned. Now, I gather from Marcia that she expects to recover very soon, and that is the great news, and that's what really matters. But she won't be speaking with me today, which is not ideal, but I'm pretty sure I'll be able to give you a good semblance of what it would have been like with both Marcia and me. So many, many thanks to Jeannie for stepping up big time to offer her services in moderating today and in keeping all the mysterious Zoom moving parts flowing smoothly. So before I give the talk I planned to give myself, I'm first going to present some brief orienting information about Catharine or the Bower, the juvenilia work of Jane Austen that is our subject today. And then I'll give you some bullet points that I've gleaned from Marcia's discussion notes, which she graciously provided to me when she realized she wasn't going to be able to complete them and give her talk herself. So first, for any of you who haven't had a chance to read Catharine, which is not very long, or read much about it, or if you have, but you'd just like to have your memory refreshed before we get into the weeds of what's going on, here's a short summary for which I thank Wikipedia, which I have simply edited the Wikipedia page down a bit for time. Catharine, or Kitty Percival, who is in her late teens, is an orphan ward of her maiden aunt, Mrs. Percival, who is very strict with her. Kitty has lost the company of her dear friends, Cecilia and Mary Wynne, whose clergyman father's death scattered their family. Prior thereto, however, Kitty, Cecilia, and Mary had planted a special bower or garden in Mrs. Percival's garden, larger garden, which now, grown to maturity, happens to be Kitty's haven and chief comfort. Now, Mrs. Percival goes to great lengths to prevent Kitty from meeting possibly unsuitable young men. Kitty is allowed to socialize only with Mr. and Mrs. Dudley and their daughter, an arrogant and quarrelsome family. And Mrs. Percival even refuses visits from the Stanleys, who are relatives of the Percivals and who are a wealthy family with political and social influence because they have a son, Edward, of marriageable age, and Mrs. Percival doesn't want Kitty to have any part of that. However, Edward has now moved to France and the Stanleys come to visit, supposedly without him. So Kitty excitedly anticipates their arrival, but she is very disappointed to find that their daughter, Camilla, has little in common with her. Kitty wants to discuss things like books and politics, but Camilla leads the conversation back to subjects Kitty views as frivolous, such as fashion and social life. So Kitty escapes to her bower. And Camilla later comes to the bower, very excited to tell Kitty that they have all been invited to the Dudleys' ball the next evening. In the morning, alas, Kitty wakes up with a violent headache, toothache, not headache, that prevents her from attending the ball. Camilla, her parents, and Mrs. Percival decide to attend the ball and leave her behind. But then Kitty's toothache begins to ease, and she's getting ready to attend the ball after all, when suddenly Camilla's brother Edward turns up at the Percivals' home, unannounced, having returned to England unexpectedly, and he convinces Kitty to go with him to the ball. Mrs. Percival is not pleased when they arrive. In the following days, Edward continues to flirt with Kitty, and it becomes apparent that he has much more in common with her than Camilla does with her. Her aunt doesn't approve of him, however, and chastises Kitty for scandalous behavior when she finds them speaking in Kitty's bower. Mr. Stanley, the father, is also displeased by Edward's flirting with Kitty and sends him back to the continent. Kitty is hurt by his abrupt departure, but Camilla tells her that he was sorry to leave, obviously because he's in love with Kitty, and Kitty therefore is in a, quote, state of satisfaction, unquote. The novella was never completed, so we do not know where the story would have gone next, although Jane Austen's nephew, James Edward Austen, later Austen Leigh, wrote a very, very brief continuation at some later point before he too broke it off unfinished. Okay, so where does female education, which you saw in the title of our presentation, come into this? Catharine and Camilla have a short conversation about books in which they talk about novels in particular. In addition, in that sort of climactic scene from the Wikipedia summary, when Catharine's aunt catches her talking, but nothing more, in the bower with Edward Stanley, Aunt Percival harangues Catharine as follows, and I'm going to read this in my best aggrieved voice. Well, this is beyond anything I could have supposed. Profligate as I knew you to be, I was not prepared for such a sight. This is beyond anything you ever did before, beyond anything I ever heard of in my life. Such impudence I never witnessed before in such a girl. And this is the reward for all the cares I have taken in your education, for all my troubles and anxieties, and heaven knows how many they have been. All I wished for was to breed you up virtuously. An interesting word, breed. I never wanted you to play upon the harpsichord, or draw better than anyone else, but I had hoped to see you respectable and good, to see you able and willing to give an example of modesty and virtue to the young people hereabouts. I bought you Blair's Sermons and Caleb's In Search of a Wife. I gave you the key to my own library and borrowed a great many good books of my neighbors for you, all to this purpose. But I might have spared myself the trouble. Oh, Catharine, you are an abandoned creature, and I do not know what will become of you. Blah, 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 blah. So, as you may have noted in the discussion materials, if you had a chance to look at them, and if not, I urge you to look at them after this presentation. Caleb's was the famous novel published in 1809 by Hannah More. Jeannie, maybe you can, you have that picture of Hannah More we can briefly show everyone?
Yeah, bring it in.
If I'm not putting you on the spot here.
Right here.
There we go. Hannah More, 1745 to 1833. She had a very long and distinguished life and career in the public eye in England. Thank you very much. Caleb's was the novel published by Hannah More relatively later in her career in 1809. And it's a kind of sermon in fiction, I would call it, illustrating More's very conservative views about female education via an impossibly, unrealistically saintly heroine. So, where did Jane Austen herself fall on this topic as to how young ladies were often educated? Marcia notes in her notes, and I'm sure you all would agree, that Jane Austen in her fiction repeatedly critiques the limitations of education for girls and young women, which includes the inadequacy and silliness of the, quote, accomplishments they were taught. But note that the fault is not per se in learning the arts, which is a nice thing, but the goal of that particular mode of education back then which was solely for young women to display themselves for the marriage market. No attempt was made to encourage or build capacity for critical thinking. And Camilla Stanley's inadequacies are the direct result of that sort of miseducation. She's unable to focus, read, or even think about anything but the latest fashion and gossip, versus, in contrast, Catharine's appreciation for books, discussing books and ideas with Camilla's brother, Edward, later on. Marcia would have then spoken about, and maybe we can bring this next slide up, about Mary Wollstonecraft on the other side of that education debate from Hannah More, writing about the dangers of training young women to develop strong minds. Now, Mary Wollstonecraft is a very famous figure from history that many of you, even those who haven't studied that era, know about. She was really the vanguard of what we would call Proto-Feminism in England, and she was also turned out to be the mother, the child that was born to her when she died, turned out to be Mary Shelley, who we of course know for Frankenstein. So let's get back to now specifically about Wollstonecraft and her perhaps most famous work, the Vindication of the Rights of Woman from 1792, so right after the French Revolution. This is a quote from that. "The education of women has of late been more attended to than formerly, yet they are still reckoned a frivolous sex and ridiculed or pitied by the writers who endeavor by satire or instruction to improve them. It is acknowledged that they spend many of the first years of their lives in acquiring a smattering of accomplishments. Meanwhile, strength of body and mind are sacrificed to libertine notions of beauty, to the desire of establishing themselves the only way woman can rise in the world, by marriage. And this desire making mere animals of them," and now we're reminded of Mrs. Percival with breeding Catharine up, "and this desire making mere animals of them when they marry, they act as such children may be expected to act," unquote. So that's very different than Hannah More on the evangelical Christian side, who also warned of the dangers of spoiling daughters in frivolous pursuits. But as I suggested earlier, her perspective was that women needed to be trained more seriously to take up their female duties in life. And here is an excerpt that Marcia selected from Hannah More's best-selling nonfiction, 1799, Strictures on the Modern System of Female Education. Quote, "The chief end to be proposed in cultivating the understandings of women is to qualify them for the practical purposes of life. Their knowledge is not often like the learning of men, to be reproduced in some literary composition, nor ever in any learned profession, but it is to come out in conduct. A lady studies not that she may qualify herself to become an orator or a pleader, nor that she may learn to debate, but to act. She is to read the best books, not so much to enable her to talk of them, as to bring the improvement which they furnish to the rectification of her principles and the formation of her habits. The great uses of study are to enable her to regulate her own mind and be useful to others," to which I can only say, ugh. So Marcia sees Austen and Catharine, and I agree, as critiquing unrealistic attitudes to men and women in Hannah More's writings, but also pushing back at More's backlash against the campaign for women's rights in education, and that's affirmative, self-affirming sense led by Mary Wollstonecraft and also by another famous female historian of that time, Catherine Macaulay, who, by the way, lived down the road at certain points from Godmersham, the estate of Jane Austen's elder brother, Edward. And I think that's more to that. But anyway, that's for another talk. Now, Marcia would also have discussed Jane Austen's well-known love of novels of all kinds, high and low, which most famously appears her credo in this regard in the defense of the novel, a passage in Northanger Abbey, where Jane Austen passionately defends novel reading and describes it as particularly as a female defense of defending female authors. And Marcia would have also outlined the facts of Jane Austen's own unusual educational history, noting that most of her education was at home, and it was basically a form of self-education where she was allowed to roam through her father's excellent home library with the encouragement of her own well-educated older brothers and also her immediately elder sister, Cassandra, And we all know that Jane Austen's education turned out pretty well, didn't it? So no problem there. And there ends my attempt to at least give you a flavor of what Marcia Hamley would have spoken about today had she had the opportunity to speak. And although Marcia and I not infrequently disagree about how we each interpret Austen, that's really not so much the case, I think, with Catharine. I agree with pretty much all that I gathered from Marcia's notes, but where you could say we differ is only that I see more things or other things in Catharine and in Jane Austen's writings in general that, as far as I can tell, have not been explored not only by Marcia, but by many other Austen scholars. So again, I acknowledge it. I'm a little bit beyond the fringe, which is my niche in the very tolerant Austen scholarly ecosystem. So, so if you're all with me and now you've got some good background, I will now strap on your seatbelts because I'm going to take you on an idiosyncratic outside the lanes tour into the wilds of Catharine or the Bower. So give me a moment, please, here. And while I'm queuing up my next part of my own talk, note that screen, what Jeannie has put up on the screen, the subtitle of my talk, my part of the talk, "It is unknown how many people have died in consequence of catching cold." And that's, again, Aunt Percival, who I quoted earlier, whom I describe as the curious prophet of Catharine or the Bower. And there you have Jane Bennet there below, who's apparently caught a cold of some kind and being nursed at Netherfield. So we can release that screen, and now give me a second, and here I'm ready for the next part. At the JASNA AGM, which will begin this Friday, and how exciting is that, there will be two presentations which will also focus on Catharine or the Bower. One by AGM mainstay and my friend Elaine Bander. Hi, Elaine, who is actually here today, I'm happy to say, in which she will make the case that Catharine rewrites Charlotte Smith's politically radical novels of the 1790s and early 1800s. And the other by Ryoko Doi, who promises to reveal Mary Queen of Scots subtext in Catharine. So the varying approaches that both Marcia and I might have to Austen, and also the two that I've just described to come at the AGM, illustrate the accuracy of Clara Toots' 2002 description of Catharine or the Bower as, quote, "a closet stuffed with puns, jokes, and charades, political and historical allusions, which are charged as counterplots of family history," unquote. That's a lot of stuff. Now, there's long been mystery surrounding Catharine, which is the betweenity, interesting word, that niece Carolyn Austen deprecated as not the proper channel for her aunt's talents. And of course, she expressed that years after her aunt's death. Catharine remained unpublished actually for a full century after Jane Austen's death, until 1922, even though it was her most ambitious juvenilia prior to the well-known Lady Susan, which was recently made into a film a few years ago entitled, confusingly, Love and Friendship by Whit Stillman, but it's an amazing film. And yet the scandalous Lady Susan came out to the world, so to speak, a full 5 decades earlier than Catharine. So why would that be? One answer that occurs to me, if you look in my discussion questions, I asked whether any of you detected some prior Austen family history in Catharine. Now the echo I hear, as did Toot, is of Jane's orphaned paternal aunt, Philadelphia, who married a much older man, Tyso Hancock, after she, as a young woman, sailed to India and endured in real life essentially the identical fate that Jane gave to one of those two orphaned Wynne sisters in Catharine, the loss of whose intimate friendship Catharine so poignantly mourns. Now, in real life, Philadelphia Austen's youthful tribulations surely were known to everyone in the Austen family, even after Jane Austen's death, including the widespread, very scandalous rumor that Phila's daughter, Eliza, the famous Eliza de Feuillide, also Eliza Austen, who married Jane's elder brother Henry after first being married to the decapitated French count, was actually the illegitimate daughter of Warren Hastings. Pretty big stuff. This obvious edgy echo helps explain, I think, why Catharine or the Bower wasn't published until more than a century after Jane's death, especially when you think about Philadelphia Austen through the lens of this passage in Catharine. Quote, Kitty had heard twice from her friend since her marriage. This is the one who was sent to India, but her letters were always unsatisfactory. And though she did not openly avow her feelings, yet every line proved her to be unhappy. She spoke with pleasure of nothing but of those amusements which they had shared together and which could return no more, and seemed to have no happiness in view but that of returning to England again. But I see even more in that suspicious century-long publication delay. Catharine, beneath its prosaic plot and barely developed, is a metonymic bower or garden in the sense that, like the Garden of Eden in the Bible and in Milton's Paradise Lost, or Spencer's Bower of Bliss, or even much more closer to Jane Austen's writing, Erasmus Darwin's Botanic Garden erotic poem, which I consider, and some others agree, are three of Austen's elusive sources, Kitty's Bower is overgrown with sexual symbolism in particular. And I joined with Toot and also Leffel and Heidt Stevenson, who wrote the articles which I cited in my discussion materials, which I urge you to follow up on to get much more complete background on this, in seeing Austen's focus on the female body and female sexuality, whether heterosexual or otherwise, as being where Jane Austen is looking. And so my primary focus today will be on female education, specifically as it relates to the sexuality of Catharine's Bower. Now, there's another mystery around Catharine that's been noticed only once before in Austen scholarship, as far as I can tell, but which I see as a significant clue to one of its elusive sources that has not been well understood. There is no clarity among Austen scholars as to what changed when Jane Austen, sometime after 1809, and it must be after 1809 because that's when Kelebs came out, tweaked her original 1792 manuscript of Catharine. Now we know that she changed the surname of Catharine and her aunt to Percival, and changed her aunt's recommended reading to Hannah More's best-selling 1809 Kelebs that I've been talking about. But did Jane Austen otherwise leave her 1792 version intact, or did she make other changes, but somehow without leaving any handwritten crossings out or insertions as markers thereof, as we have for those name changes? As to that question, why is Catharine's shallow Camilla Stanley's name so strikingly similar to that of Kelebs's erudite heroine Lucilla Stanley? You got Camilla Stanley, Lucilla Stanley. John Leffels footnoted this in passing as a coincidence, but I assert it was intentional by Jane Austen, who meant this to be noticed by anyone who might have recently read Kelebs. For starters, the manuscript that we have of Catharine doesn't reflect any crossing out or substitution of the name Camilla for some earlier name, the 29 times it appears in her manuscript, nor for the staggering 61 times that the word name Stanley appears pretty much on every page of the manuscript. Now, one could believe that Austen in 1792 psychically foresaw that her heroine's foolish friend's name would appear in slightly altered form in More's 1809 novel, which Austen then explicitly alluded to by title, or that Hannah More, by 1809 already a famous published author, as I mentioned, for over 30 years, decided to allude to the unpublished juvenile work of an unknown female author named Jane Austen. Well, of course, as you'll agree, these are two things very absurd I've just presented you, which leaves only a third reasonable explanation, i.e., that despite the 1792 date at the start of the Catharine manuscript, somehow Austen must have rewritten the manuscript in toto to some extent after 1809, not only to add the explicit reference to Kelebs, but also to implicitly allude to it, and perhaps, we don't know, some other changes. This question, I want to emphasize, is a big deal for Austen lovers of Austen, as I'm sure you'll agree, because are we to see Catharine as having been completed when Jane was not quite 17, or when she was twice that age, or even more? That's a huge disparity. But some of you, no doubt, will be thinking, name coincidences like Lucilla and Camilla Stanley, they happen in real life, and Lucilla and Camilla not that close in sound. Well, rest assured, it's not just this one parallel that supports my inference of Jane Austen engaging in rewriting based on Keleb's. It's also that Austen's introductory description of Camilla Stanley is the diametric opposite of Moore's introduction of Lucilla Stanley, almost as if Jane Austen was writing Camilla as an anti-Lucilla. The one is an impossible paragon of virtuous wisdom. The other is a dubious epitome of empty silliness. And the verbiage to describe the two is quite parallel. And I think you will agree in a second, Austenesquely funny. So for example, to give you a flavor, Camilla Stanley has, according to Moore, an understanding unimproved, oh, sorry, I've got the wrong one. Let's start with Camilla, and then I'll go to Lucilla. Camilla has an understanding unimproved by reading and a mind totally devoid of taste and judgment. Her temper was by nature good, but unassisted by reflection. She had neither patience under disappointment, nor could sacrifice her own inclinations to promote the happiness of others. All her ideas were toward the elegance of her appearance, the fashion of her dress, and the admiration she wished them to excite. She professed a love of books without reading, was lively without wit, and generally good-humored without merit. This is classic Jane Austen. Now compare the wit of that introduction of this foolish young woman to Hannah More's introduction of Lucilla Stanley in Keleb's. She appeared to unite the simplicity of nature to the refinement of good breeding. She is rather perfectly elegant than perfectly beautiful. Her beauty is countenance. It is the stamp of mind intelligibly printed on the face. And then we go on to her conversation, and it said, she had rather a playful gaiety than a pointed wit. Of repartee she had little, and dislikes it in others. Yet I have seldom, this is her suitor speaking, I have seldom met with a truer taste for inoffensive wit. Now could there be more an opposite than Jane Austen's very savage wit describing the inadequacies of Camilla Stanley's character and mind to Hannah More's earnest, pious elevation of this saintly figure? To me, clearly Jane Austen is reacting to Hannah More's, humorless, dry, piousness. And also, by the way, as a side note that relates to another aspect of Jane Austen, Lucilla Stanley in Moore's novel, excuse me, is also described in that passage by reference to John Donne's famous poem that includes a very famous line about eloquent blood, which is sort of like a blush. And what's interesting about that for Austen is that in the 1817 biographical notice about Jane Austen that was published right after her death, it is also quoted. So was the Austen family, I think, likely already busy, even before she was cold in the grave in Winchester Abbey, trying to portray her as a kind of Lucilla Stanley, rather than the Wollstonecraftian, witty person that I say she actually was. But I have even more for you on the question of the dating of Catharine's final composition. And I'm sort of hammering this because I think it's an important point to convince. Lucilla Stanley in Keleb's also creates a special dower for herself and friends, female friends, just as Catharine does for herself and the Wynne sisters. And Keleb's and Catharine are also interwoven in a third way via a third very famous female author who we've already mentioned, which I'll get to in a second. Keleb's includes an inset moral tale, sort of like one of those digressions that you saw in old novels that are not part of the main plot, which echoes in strikingly specific details an inset tale in a 1788, so 4 years before Jane Austen began, excuse me one second, before Jane began, what is my computer doing? Catharine, and it's an English translation of a German book of moral tales that is titled in English, Elements of Morality. Now, here's the kicker. Who was the translator into English of that book of moral tales? None other than Mary Wollstonecraft, the very same adversary of Hannah More in the Education War. So you can see the plot begins to thicken here because as far as I know, nobody's ever noticed that connectivity to Wollstonecraft's translation. And here's more. In that same inset tale, in Elements of Morality, which is only a tiny part of Elements of Morality as a whole, we find a reference to things all going to 6s and 7s. And you'll recognize this if you've recently read Catharine. That is the very same cliche which Aunt Percival repeats not once, twice, or 3 times, but 4 times in Catharine, as if she was reciting a magic spell like Beetlejuice, Beetlejuice, Beetlejuice. So you got all that, and then it's also noteworthy that Wollstonecraft's Vindication, which we read you a quote from before that Marcia had selected, and Moore's Kelebs, like Austen's Bower, both focus on a common literary ancestor, which is Eve in Milton's Paradise Lost. They both focus on it from different points of view. So Catharine, one way we can think about what happens in the beginning of Catharine is that she cherishes the bower that she and the Wind sisters created before the sisters were in effect expelled, like Adam and Eve, from Chetwynd, their little village, by fate, or we could say by the patriarchy, losing both Catharine and their beloved bower and having to be sent far away, if you will, east, not of Eden, but of England. So no, I say that Occam's razor dictates only one plausible explanation for this densely interwoven Wollstonecraft male Moore intertextuality in Catharine, that Jane Austen revised the text of Catharine sometime after Kelebs was published in 1809 in order to subtly weave into it both a parody of Moore's Kelebs and also a positive wink at Wollstonecraft into what surely was the original version of Catharine that would have been a lot less complex when she wrote it in 1792 at age 17. So what might all this mean? Well, as you can guess, I'm here with an answer. Whether you agree or not, it'll be interesting. So, but first, I have to give you one more new point to keep in mind before I get to my further explanation. Catharine is the earliest Austen fiction which resembles her published novels in one crucial aspect. It has a third-person narrative voice with an exclusive, limited focal point of view through the eyes of only one person, the young heroine. That is the hallmark, as I'm sure if you think about it, you'll readily see, of all of the Austen novels, including, by the way, the Watsons and the Sanditon fragments. Now, this universally, at least from Austen's point of view, which is very unusual, not that many novelists did this, but this universally limited point of view makes it possible for different readers to plausibly interpret that narrative voice very differently. Think about it. You can either read the narrative as a primarily objective and therefore reliable, omniscient, if you will, narrator, or you can choose to read the narrative primarily as subjective and through the eyes of the heroine and therefore possibly unreliable. Both are plausible, intelligent ways of reading the same text. And so therefore, once we are able to free ourselves from Catharine's point of view, if we can find a way to do that, and we can see Aunt Percival, perhaps we can see that behind her seeming paranoia about catching cold, which is the subtitle of my talk here, and everything going to 6s and 7s, maybe we can see this aunt not as a comic precursor of Woodhouse and therefore to be dismissed, but as a female Hamlet who perhaps has a feminist method in her madness. Now, Aunt Percival, like most women over 40 in Austen's fiction, is not a sympathetic character. From Mrs. Allen and Mrs. Ferris in the early published novels, all the way to Lady Denham and Diana Parker in the Sanditon fragment, there's a sad parade of about a dozen older women who are figures of mockery and or even contempt. And the only exception I'm aware of is Mrs. Croft from Persuasion, being a very positive figure. Even in Jane Austen's History of England, also a juvenilia work, which actually immediately preceded Catharine in the manuscript, one monarch takes more heat than all the others combined. Guess who? The older female Queen Elizabeth. And as Annette Upfall pointed out a decade ago at the Chawton House conference that I was happy to attend, Cassandra's miniature portrait of Shakespeare's Queen Elizabeth resembles both the real-life Mrs. Austen, which would be interesting standing alone, but it also happens to resemble a stereotypical wicked witch. So think about what that suggests, and that's not a good thing. So definitely not an older woman getting respect. in Jane Austen's words. So while we shouldn't be surprised to see a ridiculous character like Aunt Percival and Catharine, we ought to be on alert not to misread her aunt, the way, for example, Emma misreads and grossly underestimates Miss Bates, despite the sense Miss Bates actually makes once we are rereading and we know about Jane and Frank having been involved. You find out that Miss Bates is saying all kinds of stuff that Emma should have paid attention to. And especially so if Catharine has been, as I suggest, materially altered by Jane Austen after 1809, which means essentially just before she revised and published Sense and Sensibility in 1811. So in Aunt Percival's superficial absurdity, I hear overtones of sense which point to that great debate about female education between Wollstonecraft and More. Question, was a strong mind developed by education a right, as Wollstonecraft would say, women deserved for themselves, or was it primarily so as to make them better, i.e. more obedient and efficient handmaids, wives, to the husbands that they would then bear many children for, as Hannah More advocated. Now, in my admittedly non-mainstream scholarly opinion, Jane Austen was an even more radical feminist than Mary Wollstonecraft, particularly fiercely concerned about the strength and autonomy of both the female mind and the female body, as we noted from that passage from the Vindication. As I argued in my talk at the 2017 JASNA AGM, so only 3 years ago, in all of Austen's writing, from her early juvenilia to all her 1817 writings when she's about to die, she never deviated, as far as I can see, from her advocacy, albeit often coded, for women developing strong minds so as to survive in a world rigged against them in almost every way. And that survival was at greatest risk when men had control over women's bodies. Now, Austen parted with Wollstonecraft as well as More. This is where it gets really interesting, on the hot issue of novel reading by women. Both of them, despite their other differences, mistrusted women reading novels. Whereas Austen understood something very profound that eluded even those great thinkers, which is that the best way to assist women to develop strong minds and to inspire them to stand tall was to write female-centric stories, novels that would both inspire them on the surface, but would also be ambiguous enough via that double sort of narration possibility that I described to provide a kind of literary LA fitness gym, if you will, for developing mental muscles for becoming sharper elves. And so I see Aunt Percival's paranoia about catching cold as Austen's preview of Northanger Abbey. You say, why Northanger Abbey? Well, at the 2010 JASNA AGM in Portland, one of my other presentations to the national group, I argued that the principal subtext of Northanger Abbey is about Mrs. Tilney, the late Mrs. Tilney, as the symbol of all the English wives who died in childbirth in horrifically large numbers during Jane Austen's life and way before and way after, including 3 of Jane Austen's sisters-in-law. And what horrified Jane Austen most of all was that the state, the clergy, and the culture all turned a blind eye to this female targeting plague. So sorry, fans of Henry Tilney, this could and did happen in Jane Austen's England. So when you think about it, and this is a serious comment, looking around at the world today at this pivotal moment in history, and thinking about that same ignoring of serious problems, I can only sadly say, plus ça change. So anyway, death in childbirth as a 5-alarm fire being ignored is hidden in plain sight, I suggest, in Aunt Percival's strange speech. And I'll quote it now, picking up from right after Catharine freaks her aunt out about being in the bower at a late hour with a man. So as you listen to me now, listen for the many coded hints that I claim that Jane Austen drops about fears of getting pregnant and then dying in childbirth. So think of catching a cold as getting pregnant, if you will. I am astonished at my own imprudence, says Mrs. Percival. How could I be so forgetful as to sit down out of doors at such a time of night? I shall certainly have a return of my rheumatism after it. I begin to feel very chill already. I must have caught a dreadful cold by this time. I am sure of being lain up all the winter after it. Then, reckoning with her fingers, let me see, this is July. The cold weather will soon be coming in. August, September, October, November, December, January, February, March, April. Very likely I may not be tolerable again before May. I must and will have that arbor pulled down. It will be the death of me. And who knows, but what I may never recover. Such things have happened. My particular friend, Miss Sarah Hutchinson's death was occasioned by nothing more. She stayed out late one evening in April, got wet through, for it rained very hard, and never changed her clothes when she came home. It is unknown how many people have died in consequence of catching cold. I do not believe there is a disorder in the world except the smallpox, which does not spring from it. Yada, yada, yada. And so, first, a little note to the punsters among you, and I confess to being one, that when we hear Miss Aunt Percival's speech, think about her saying that she is astonished. The middle syllable is S-T-O-N, as in stone, as in Wollstonecraft. And then referring to the death of her friend, Sarah Hutchinson, as nothing more, in quotes, as in Hannah More. Perhaps those are too groan-worthy for you, but I think Jane Austen is sort of underlining that this speech is all about the war of ideas between Hannah More and Mary Wollstonecraft. Anyway, in 2006, a long while ago, when this passage first caught my eye, I blithely assumed that Aunt Percival's counting on her fingers all 9 months of a pregnancy was just the young Jane Austen's scandalous private family joke. Perhaps about Mrs. Knight, her wealthy brother Edward's adoptive mother, whom she similarly joked about in a letter to Cassandra in January of 1801, when Mrs. Knight was already widowed and aged 48. I cannot think so ill of her, however, in spite of your insinuations, as to suspect her of having lain in. I do not think she would be betrayed beyond an accident at the utmost. But now I know that Jane Austen had much bigger feminist fish to fry on this crucial yet ignored issue. This is what Jane Austen writes. I cannot think so ill of her, however, in spite of your insinuations, which you can be sure Cassandra didn't insinuate anything, in spite of your insinuations as to suspect her of having lain in. I do not think she would be betrayed beyond an accident at the utmost. Think about that, what she's saying there, that her 48-year-old aunt got knocked up by accident. But now I know that Austen had much bigger feminist fish to fry on that crucial yet ignored issue. And that also teaches me that it was not a coincidence that 4 events occurred in steady succession in the Austen family chronology. First, in October of 1808, Elizabeth Knight, Jane's sister-in-law, dies a horrible death in the aftermath of her 11th childbirth in just 15 years. In January of 1809, so 3 months later, Hannah More publishes Elves, and Austen reads it and snarks at it in a letter to Cassandra shortly after, in the last letter that she wrote while they were still living in Southampton. On April Fool's Day, and that date is relevant, of 1809, so that's 3 more months, she writes to Edgerton, the famous Ashton Dennis pseudonymous letter, to demand return of the still unpublished manuscript of Northanger Abbey. And then in July of 1809, Jane, Cassandra, and their mother and Martha move into Chawton Cottage, ending their wanderings in the wilderness of southern England, when now Jane Austen can revisit and get back to being a writer for the first time in years. So to me, this helps explain Austen's revision of Catharine after Elves was published. It is inextricably linked to her reclaiming of literally the manuscript of Northanger Abbey, but also of her teenage Wollstonecraft-inspired feminism. Because remember, Catharine's date, 1792, is right after the French Revolution and Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman. With her hobby horse, Jane Austen's particular hobby horse obsession with married women's lack of reproductive control. And Aunt Percival's fear of catching cold connects to one more hidden riddle in Catharine. Then I'll be done giving you riddles. The discussion of novels and history by Catharine and silly Camilla Stanley, which is clearly, no one would disagree, the origin of Henry, Eleanor, and Catherine in Northanger Abbey debating the pros and cons of reading history versus reading novels. There is one explicit in Catharine to a Shakespeare history play, which I say, not coincidentally, occurs immediately before Mrs. Percival's strange speech that I've just been focused on. As Kitty enjoys a spirited conversation with the enigmatic Edward Stanley, we read, "He could therefore always take either side and always argue with temper. They had continued, therefore, for some time conversing in this manner on the character of Richard III, which he," meaning Edward, "was warmly defending." So when Edward Stanley simultaneously imitates and defends the evil Richard III, I see that Austen has another Shakespeare history play in mind too, Richard II, which, like Richard III, has a leg, if you think about it, in both fiction and history. So it sort of sits astride the debate. In the early scene, when Richard's queen expresses prophetic forebodings as to the mortal danger to both her husband and then subsequently to the kingdom as a whole, which will arise when Henry Bolingbroke is first going to usurp him, and then there's going to be the War of the Roses that is going to come. It has been noted by scholars that the queen obsessively deploys imagery of pregnancy and childbirth in her apocalyptic fears, which she didn't have to do it. Shakespeare could have used 100 different metaphors. That's the one he picks for her. But that's not all that reminds me of Aunt Percival's strange pregnancy speech in that scene. It's also the way that Austen and Catherine playfully points us to the next part of that scene, when the Duke of York delivers the bad news to the queen, exactly the worst thing that she thinks is going to happen. He shows up and says it. And then he sighs and he says, "And everything is left at 6 and 7. So, and in case you're wondering, that is the one and only usage of that cliche in the entirety of Shakespeare. So it's not like it was everywhere. It's only in that scene. So we got at 6 and 7 again, as with the wink to Wollstonecraft's translation of the German moral tale, which also has 6 and 7, Austen is engaging in veiled allusion, but this time to point to the national catastrophe of all the colds being caught by all the English women who failed to keep their persistent husbands or their serpent-like rake, wooers out of their bowers. That's the real War of the Roses that Jane Austen is worried about. And then, I'll leave this other part out because it's kind of silly, but I see also Jane Austen joking about the numbers 6 and 7, and then Richard II and Richard III, and this sort of playing with numbers. It's the kind of corny joke that I think she actually enjoyed as a way of sort of, because she's explicitly referring to Richard III, but she's implicitly referring to Richard II, and she wants us to realize that, because then she'll get to the goal, she'll get to the stuff that really is connected. So I see this, in this sense, Jane Austen satirizing Hannah More's core message, which she wrote in her influential strictures and again in Keleb's, that More asserted that the stability, many Austen scholars have noted this, More asserted that the stability of the nation and its government depends on women, and in particular, women's bodies being subjugated to patriarchal norms. And now I will quote briefly Leffel from his article that I cited, because he does this beautifully. Mrs. Percival does follow more sophisticated commentators like Hannah More in adhering to the belief that imaginative freedoms, such as those imparted by epistolary correspondence and unregulated reading, are intimately related to female sexuality, and if not strictly controlled, will directly lead to the downfall of all social and moral order. Or to put it another way, will bring the kingdom to, quote, rack and ruin, as Aunt Percival says. So I see Austen as staking out a third position, well beyond both Wollstonecraft and More. Just as Mrs. Bennet's exaggerated fears have a rational foundation, that women were in trouble if they didn't marry, so too Aunt Percival is a seeming fool who is actually what I would call a curious prophet, like a curious pheasant, an exotic creature. The rack and ruin Austen and Mrs. Percival warn of correctly identifies the actual victims, which are not English society as a whole, but English women and their poor, abused bodies. That is the national tragedy I spoke of a decade ago regarding Northanger Abbey, the one when Austen railed a dozen times during 20 years plus of letters that catching cold, i.e. getting serially pregnant, was the greatest risk that married women ran in Austen's England. They were the poor animals who became like breeding cows until they, as they far too often did, died in childbirth. I'm almost done. Or in another metaphor inspired by Shakespeare in Northanger Abbey, I suggest that Austen saw the English wives, all the English wives, as soldiers conscripted into an army against their will, or even in many cases their awareness, doomed to die in a domestic war in which the battlefield was that of the female reproductive body. And the Shakespeare history play, another one, which I believe Austen was pointing to for this metaphor, was Henry V, particularly the scene the night before the Battle of Agincourt, when Henry in disguise is visiting his fearful troops and is confronted by one very brave soldier about the carnage of severed arms and legs, which are expected the next day, but actually didn't happen. Austen, with characteristic savage wit and irony, converts that serious moment into the joke at the beginning of Northanger Abbey about the Morlands as a fine family because they have the right number of arms and legs. That's Jane Austen for you. And actually, as Austen and all of England knew long before 1809, Mary Wollstonecraft herself in real life died in childbirth horribly in 1798, more than a decade before Austen's Kelebs-based revision of Catharine. So tragically, ironically, nowhere that I can find, and if someone can find it, please point me to it, in Wollstonecraft's or More's writings, can I find any reference to this devastating female plague of death in childbirth. It's just not there for them. Jane Austen and her improbable alter ego, Anne Percival, therefore, are unknown, unheard, uttering a wail that her famous contemporaries did not join her in. So now, if I have not thrown these proceedings entirely into a state of sixes and sevens, let the Q&A begin, and I encourage everyone in particular to bring, first of all, argue with me to your heart's delight about any of my outrageous claims, bring any new things that I didn't discuss, and we'll see where we go. And oh, I meant to mention that I put Jane Bennett in that photo for a reason about catching cold, because that has to do with the shadow story of Pride and Prejudice, and that's a topic for another day. So anyway, thank you all very much.
If there's a way for virtual clapping, I'll do that. That's very good, Arnie.
Thank you. So Jeannie, I'm in your hands.
Okay, there's been some interesting comments in the chat session. I'm going to summarize a couple, and then also if you want to chat, put a little note to me in chat, and we'll call on you so we don't have 6 people speaking at the same time. Excellent talk, boy. That was fascinating. There were quite a few comments about women over 40, because you had mentioned, Arnie, that generally in Jane Austen, those women, any woman over 40 is not a sympathetic character. And I mentioned Lady Susan might be about 40 or over 40, and she's not particularly sympathetic, but she's not a figure of mockery either.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And I actually, in my 2017 talk, I focus on her particularly as an alter ego of Jane Austen, interestingly. So yeah, she is a very interesting exception to the general rule. And also note, not in a published novel.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. Another suggestion was Mrs. Goddard. She is described as caring for the girls in her care in Emma.
True, except she's a peripheral character. But
right. Very
true,
peripheral.
True.
Also, Mrs. Jennings becomes a more sympathetic character towards the end during Marianne's illness.
She's an interesting case because I sort of equate her a little bit to Miss Bates, that superficially she appears to be, or let's put it this way, Eleanor, generally speaking, through most of the novel, finds Mrs. Jennings irritating as hell. I agree that near the end, when Mrs. Jennings steps up and takes care of Marianne, that alters Eleanor's perception of her. But I think in general, she is sort of presented as a kind of blah, 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 yada, yada, yada kind of character, and very much, whereas Miss Bates is like an extreme version of that, let's say.
I'm just going to make one more comment from the chat and then open it up to people who want to make a comment, because I think this one might lead to some controversy. Someone writes, so did Marianne in Sense and Sensibility have a cold?
Yes. Yes. I mean, I could elaborate on that if anyone wants me to, but she did, even though I don't think that Willoughby is the father.
Goodness.
You will not like.
If anyone would like to talk or make a comment or a rebuttal perhaps, but just unmute yourself and go at it.
Hi, now I want to know about Marianne, who might be, I don't know, that father.
Okay. It's not as.
Can you tell me?
For me, yes, it's not as clearly defined for me as it is when this meme repeats in Pride and Prejudice with Jane Bennet or with, I'm trying to think of who else. Those are the main ones in the published novels, but it's Edward. Edward is a sleazy dude in the shadow story of Sense and Sensibility, as I read it. He's not a positive character. Eleanor doesn't see him, but because we see him, we see everyone through Eleanor's eyes. Remember what I said about the focal point of view? She forgives him everything. She even almost forgives Willoughby. You know, remember at the end, she's ready to forgive him because I think she's attracted to him too. But she thinks of herself as being very rational and seeing people as they really are. And we buy into it because we're so totally identified with her because she's the center of the novel. So that's what I call it.
Wow. Wow, thank you. You have given me so much to think about.
Thank you. Well, you know what I recommend when I make
Jeannie,
when I make one of these crazy claims, what I recommend immediately is go back yourself, reread the first 8 or 9 chapters of Sense and Sensibility as if what I was saying was true, and then think in particular about the conversation that Edward and Marianne have when they talk about the landscape and the dirty bottoms and all that stuff. Just read that and think about what that might mean and how Eleanor maybe is the only person not in on what's really being discussed there. I hope I haven't stunned everyone else into shock or appalled thing here.
I've got a couple of comments.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, first, to back you up on something you gave as an exception to your women over 40 observation, Mrs. Croft, I believe she was actually under 40, in her late 30s, if memory serves, maybe 38. I think her age is mentioned once.
Oh, so she's a lot younger than the Admiral then, I take it. Or maybe maybe we don't even know how old he is, right? He's sort of indeterminate. Yeah.
I don't think we know how old the Admiral is, but I believe her age is mentioned once. It's 38 comes to mind. So.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you for clarifying that. I didn't check that.
I wanted to help you out first before I go on to the next point.
Hit me hard. Go ahead.
Well, if Jane Austen was going to go to all the trouble of rewriting Catharine in 1809, 1810, whenever that was, as a vehicle for arguing against the book that came out in 1809 and its position, why did she not, if she went to the trouble of rewriting Catharine, why didn't she go to the trouble of finishing it? That's what I can't understand.
It's what I was mentioning at the beginning, that this is a pattern with her, with the Watsons, and there's another, and of course Sanditon, but she got sick. But the Watsons and Lady Susan is sort of drastically cut off before it goes to what would feel like a more natural, complete ending. Your guess is as good as mine, but I'd say that particularly because of what I have come to see as Northanger Abbey and Catharine having, in a sense, the same underlying energy, the underlying thing about death and childbirth, maybe when she was able to get back Northanger Abbey and look at whatever state it was in that she had left it when she sent it in 1798, maybe she looked at them both and she thought, I'm not quite as happy with this. I think I'd rather take this horse and run with it in Northanger Abbey. And that she chose then to sort of transplant all this energy. She did this for a little while in Catherine, and then she hopped to another horse and said, Northanger Abbey is the better vehicle for this argument. I can weave in more because Catherine is such a skeleton, it's such a small scaffolding that she was going to have to add all kinds of, maybe also that over time she had her control over character. I know Collins has written a lot about Jane Austen's evolution as a writer, Collins Hemingway, who's here today, that her maturity and her sense of control over a bigger scope of writing, and she thought that she had not created a big enough canvas in Catherine, so perhaps she said, no, I need to take on something bigger. But I'm just guessing, just like anybody else.
Do you have any thoughts specifically about the metaphorical significance of the bower? You may remember I mentioned before you got started that I saw parallels between the bower and the East Room, where
Yes.
Fanny Price found her refuge. And I see those as both metaphors for the interiority of the character's ownership of herself, her agency, not agency focused outward into overt acts, but agency focused inward on taking ownership of herself and the right to define who she is, who she's going to be.
I think that's absolutely brilliant. And the only thing I could add to that in the positive sense is that Jane Austen, you know how she was someone who was a skilled artisan for, doing various handicrafts and things like that, as well as many other things. She never wasted a stitch. So in a sense, I would say you're defining another broad sector of the meaning of this metaphor, which is parallel, not in place of, but parallel to the sexual aspect, which again, those articles I cited are the 3 best existing articles that delve deeply into the implications in that angle. And I bet you could write a very long, fruitful article about exactly what you're talking about, because I think they're both there, is what I'm saying.
Well, thank you, Arnie, and I agree with you that those metaphorical interpretations are not mutually exclusive at all.
Thank you.
Arnie, a couple of people in chat referred to the bower as a metaphor for a room of one's own. And one wonders if Virginia Woolf ever got a copy of Catharine or the Bower, since it was published in 1922.
That's absolutely, whoever said that, absolutely brilliant. I had never thought about that, but of course, and actually that relates to what Michael just said. Yeah, wouldn't that be wild if A Room of Its Own was published the year after Catherine, and it turned out that it was, because I often do think that, when you look at many of these later great writers like Charlotte Bronte, the one who pretended she didn't like Jane Austen, but she really did, and Mark Twain, who did the same thing, and Vladimir Nabokov, for example. I believe Lolita in some way was inspired by Mansfield Park, for example, the dark side of Mansfield Park. I see Jane Austen having that effect on the greatest of the later writers, not the hacks, but the people with the greatest imagination are the ones who could sort of grasp something from her shadows, even if they might or might not have seen a full-blown shadow story, but they pick up enough of this dark matter, and then they're inspired by it to then take it in their own direction. And when you look at the intertextuality at the other end of the telescope, not what Jane Austen was alluding to, but who alluded to her, it actually casts very interesting light on her writing itself. So I wouldn't be surprised if The Voyage Out or something has something of this in it, something of Catherine in it as well. If we, I don't know The Voyage Out really hardly at all, but I could see that being the case. That's a wonderful comment. Who made that comment? That was lovely.
A couple of people did.
Oh,
Do you want to speak up, the people who made that comment?
yeah. Or elaborate or go further.
Make sure you unmute yourself if you want to talk. Maybe not.
If not, then
Amy, could I jump in?
yes, please, Colin.
First, a couple of questions, because I have lost one of my books, which is, in fact, Catherine Sutherland's version of the juvenilia, so I can't put my hand on it right away. But I believe you were talking about the changing of names. but I believe she said that it was James Edward who changed the name of Catherine, Catherine's family to Percival to make the family sound more proper or something. And if somebody remembers that detail, they should pipe up. The other question would be,
I won't stop you for the second question, but let me answer that right away before I forget what I want to say, and then do your second part. That's brilliant. I didn't remember that. I may have seen that once before and it didn't stick. That would be very interesting because that would begin to explain how she would have changed the whole thing. And yet, why did she have only these pieces changed? Maybe the answer is he did it, like you're saying. And if he did it, it means that maybe the whole manuscript of what we think of as Catherine in some way was rewritten by her or is even, it just is interesting. So I love it. So now what's your second part?
well, to follow up on that, from both Sutherland and Brian Southam, who've seen these actual manuscripts, they think most of the Bower is in Jane's handwriting, and only the last couple of pages that James Edward apparently added on is in his handwriting and different. So it looks like he changed something fairly late, which may have been after any of the 1809 changes, or perhaps he was the one who put the more proper Caleb's in there himself. I don't know. The other question is whether we happen to know, and I don't know, who actually had control of the Catharine manuscript, because a lot of the different Austen manuscripts have come up at different times, and it could be that this was kept in the background because of the Aunt Philadelphia business or whatever, or it could be that some of the family just didn't want to bring stuff forward. I think Deirdre LeFay, by gaining the confidence of the family over time, managed to bring stuff out, letters and whatnot, that we didn't have before. But I don't remember who had Catherine and where it came from. Perhaps somebody else did out there.
I'm going to guess
it was given to James Edward, and that's why Catherine Sutherland believes he started playing with it, finishing it, and changing the names from very plain names. I mean, the names like Camilla and Lucilla and Stanley were all novelistic names that float around in all sorts of novels. But Jane Austen started out with Kitty Peterson, which was not a novelistic name. So James Edward, just like they prettied up her portrait, he fancied up the names.
And I would add to that, and those of you who I've corresponded with or spoken to online over the years know, I consider James Edward Austen Lee as the arch bad guy of distorting the portrait in every possible way of Jane Austen for the rest of the world. I believe, for example, based on an article that came out in Persuasion a couple of years ago by Juliet Wells, I think, about the biographical notice and some peculiarities regarding the 1817 biographical notice, the 1833, I came to the conclusion that he actually probably was the one who wrote the 1817 notice. And then Henry Austen sort of tweaked it in 1833. Rather, everybody's always attributed both to Henry, but I think I see the hand of James Edward, even in 1817, that guy at the age of 19 is already mucking around, and in his memoir, he's distorting her letters, he's editing them, editing out things he doesn't like. There's nothing this guy wouldn't do in order to distort the portrait of Jane Austen for posterity, because I think his mother and her didn't get along. And it may be as simple as that. This is some kind of cosmic 50-year revenge that he's taking on her to make the world not understand who Jane Austen really was, which was probably not heterosexual and probably didn't want to marry men and probably was all kinds of things. So of course he's going to paint a picture of her like Lucilla Stanley from Keleb's. What a revenge. He wipes her out as she really was, and instead puts that portrait like he did with her Cassandra's portrait. So, but Elaine, why don't you chime in with anything or everything that you felt when you were listening?
Well, no, I think that was extremely shrewd, and I think I share the same DNA of understanding of the pieces you do. You took it in places I would never begin to go. It's wonderful. I love the argument. Not sure I would dare, well, I know I wouldn't dare to make it myself. I'm going on a safer path, let's say. But yeah,
Can you give us a
very,
taste?
very stimulating. Thank you.
Can you give the room a taste of what you're gonna, whatever you feel you want to say about your talk next week?
Oh, yeah. Well, the most general thing is that she was clearly reading lots of Smith at the time, and Smith was hugely famous. And what Austen is doing, I think in this novel, she's transitioning from laughing at what she reads by exaggerating it to bringing it down to 3 or 4 families in a country village, in the home counties, ordinary middle-class life, instead of the high life aristocratic Gothic and romantic stuff that you get in Charlotte Smith. So she, bit by bit, and that's why I think she started with a very plainly named character instead of Emmeline or Etheline. It's Kitty Peterson. So that's really what I'm doing.
I can't wait. Which is your time slot again? Which day?
Oh, the end of Saturday as usual. I always get, mop up when everyone's off at the bar, but they won't be able to go off to the bar this time.
Well, I'm definitely going to be there all
Thanks.
ears for your talk. Thank you.
I'd like to just pop in and make a quick notice, since we're talking about James Edwards' possible influence on it. Catharine Sutherland wrote this wonderful piece. It's called show it to you here. I don't know if you can see the title. Anyway, it's From Kitty to Catharine, James Edward Austen's Hand in Volume the Third.
I love it.
And she actually goes into, showing, I don't know if you can read this, but it's his handwriting. Because he did childhood writings as well. And in fact, he was only 9 during, part of the time when Jane Austen was hanging out with him and his older sister, Anna Lefroy. And Catharine Sutherland makes the point that perhaps Jane Austen was even using the unfinished Catherine as sort of a masterclass in teaching writing to her niece and nephew.
Sure.
And who knows how much of this is true, but it's fascinating reading. And it's interesting that the handwriting that she shows of a teenage James Edward isn't that dissimilar to Jane Austen's. And she speculates that he actually on purpose manipulated his handwriting more when he possibly made modifications in the manuscript. And that is why it is so difficult really to definitively say, yes, those are James Edwards' edits versus Jane Austen's edits.
We're getting into the talented Mr. Ripley territory here. I don't know if you saw the movie, but when Matt Damon's character impersonates, what's his name? The other guy, he kills somebody and then he impersonates him. And he practices writing his handwriting so he can write a letter in his handwriting in order to get money from the father of the dead man. I wouldn't put anything. James Edward Austen was a very clever man, but he was a man on a mission, and I don't particularly like his mission.
Arnie, if I could jump in here again,
Yeah.
I agree with your general view that James Edward Baldrives, I can never pronounce that name, Jane Austen's biography. I think it has more to do, though, with just the fact that he was a stiff and not particularly, he didn't have a lot of humor, but he was a clergyman wanting to protect not only her reputation, but also the family's. But as far as him writing the 1817 biographical note, that's where I probably say I don't see that, because first of all, he was only 17 or 18 years old at the time. He would not have had the experience to write the very loving and affectionate words there that we get, I think, sincerely from Henry. And I kind of support that because even 50 years later, when you read the memoir and you read the contributions by his two sisters, half sister, the worst and stiffest part of the book is when he's writing, when he's telling the story of the other women, basically using what they have written. It is much more lively, much more affectionate. And I just don't think he would have had the chops at the age of 17 or 18 to write that piece, even if Henry were to edit it later.
You make an excellent argument. I can't say you sort of persuade me in a way, but I have a blog post, which I'll send you the link for later, in which I was reacting to Juliet Wells's article when it first came out in Persuasions about that prompted me to really look at this for the first time. And what there is that is fascinating is that between the 1817 notice, the 1833 Bentley version, which is clearly Henry Austen because he has correspondence. So that is the one that is, and also the 1870 memoir. If you look at it like there are certain things that are mentioned in 1817, mentioned in 1870, but not in 1833, and vice versa. So on that argument, sort of like the documentary hypothesis with the Torah, that I'm suggesting that he it was like a cat and mouse game over 50 years between James Edward and Henry about who's going to define Jane to the world. But I also want to also affirm what you're saying about him protecting his family. I mean, I stated it in sort of egregious terms about revenge or something, but I think picking up on your idea of James Edward as stiff, I agree with you. And I think that he was carrying also a legacy from his father, because I think James, the firstborn, the mother's favorite in some ways in the Austen family, he had real pretensions to being a writer, right? He wrote poetry, he edited, he was the leader with Henry on the Loiterer. He thought of himself as a writer, and yet he winds up as a small village vicar. And then comes along the little sister, half his age, writing better than he can. And I think that there was the seeds of a resentment there that is not only the fact that I think Jane portrayed James and Mary as Fanny and John Dashwood in the beginning of Sense and Sensibility. That is absolutely, in my mind, clear that this is a terrible satire of them as not being very good people. That I see all this wound together. It's all the things you said, it's the things I'm saying, and I think it would actually make a fascinating story to tell of this family saga that is so complicated.
Arnie, can I ask a question?
Please.
Okay, so first of all, I want to thank you. And I want to say, I think that the concern with pregnancy, it really meshes with what I see this novel as, which is Jane, and I'm going to say it in my talk, like Catharine is a kind of coming out for Jane Austen novel, not coming out queer, but coming out as a mature author.
Maybe coming out queer too, but anyway. That's
well, maybe I'm not gonna follow you down that rabbit hole, but definitely like her coming out as a mature author and a woman. So I mean, I think that really makes sense to me. But my question is sort of maybe a bit naive and historical. Like, what's Austen's solution? Like, practice rhythm and birth, keep your pants on, guys. I mean, they don't really have a lot of other solutions. So what? I mean, if you're on a campaign to ameliorate something, usually there's some solution that you have in mind. I just can't think of what.
Well, other than like in one of the letters, separate beds. Remember, there's one line in one of the letters, don't they know about separate beds? And words to that effect, but that's all joking. I think it's a marvelous question. And if anyone else, after I'm done right now, anyone else who wants to chime in, that might be a good topic for a lot of people.
I think if you look at what she read Sir Grandison, she read Camilla, she read that her brothers said that she practically memorized every conversation. She was a strong believer in the right of women to be celibate. That was what those writings were about, in my opinion. That was what she was for.
So like in Grandison, which I have only read about and have really not read because I just haven't girded my loins for that. Give us a quick read on how that plays out in Grandison.
Well, the characters are always avoiding forced marriage and rape. And in one story, the victim was raped. In the second one, she ends up marrying a decent guy while running away from a non-decent guy. But they actually sat around and talked about the rights of women on the continent, because they were still Roman Catholic, to join a nunnery to get and to be celibate, whereas in Britain, Sir Grandison was saying a woman has no choice but to marry. Her family can force her to marry. So yeah, I think that was in the forefront of her mind, the right to be single.
Yeah, but I mean, but Grandison is very, very careful. I mean, even if there's a kind of coercion to really say that marriage has to be entered into willingly, and
Yes.
you know, and I think there's I mean, the whole issue of childbirth becomes the point around which Charlotte Grandison capitulates to a patriarchal society, you know, and eventually embraces it. And so I don't know. I mean, I don't, it was an issue, but maybe Jane might not have been on the same place as Richardson.
Yeah, I don't think she answers the question for married women, what to do.
Right.
Yeah,
No,
and that's where we are. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the problem.
Well, it's a fantastic question, Wendy, and I don't know that I have to run this through and think whether there's any of the stories that can be sort of filtered through that and where she comes up with some ingenious solution. The only other one is I'm reminded of my theory that both Mrs. Bennet and Mary Musgrove have something in common, which is that they're basically, I have a headache, dear philosophy of how not to have more children. And I think there's something to that even if you wind up being, or Charlotte, even better, if you're a lesbian, as I think Charlotte is, marry a gay man like Collins, and then everybody will be happy. You'll be able to do whatever you need to do privately, and nobody will bother you.
Yeah, and then there's Mrs. Crofts. They have this great marriage. They don't have children, and there's immoral.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And above all, Jane Austen herself. You know, I think that it's a myth that is not real, that she was considering, we don't have any documentation that I know of that she was considering actually marrying that buffoon, the rich guy, whose name is escaping me, in 1802. But I often wonder whether they had to make up a story, because otherwise it looks like she went through her entire adult life without ever having a serious courtship after Tom Lefroy, you know, in 1796 when she's 20, not even 21. So it may be that, yeah.
This conversation is clarifying to me, finally at last, why Jane Austen had such an affinity for Catholicism. It's very clear in her history of England. She's very pro Mary Queen of Scots, of course, but she also says, I am very partial to the Catholic religion. And maybe she wanted to have that as a safety net, a virtual room of one's own for women to escape to so they could be celibate.
That's another article right there you got, yeah. Who has not spoken who would like to have a chance? Because we don't.
Arnie, if I may, friend, can I ask a question? Ties in with what you've just been talking about, chastity and education, actually. You've been talking about the name part, the name change to Percival. And maybe this is a bit fanciful, but it would be interesting to know who actually did it, whether it was Jane herself or a brother, because Percival is very actually close to the name, reminds me of the story of Percival, the Christian de Troyes. And you have a similar situation in that story. Well, there are many different versions of the story, but in the majority of the versions, you have a kind of locus amoenus there too. Percival's mother keeps him away from society because she wants him to grow up pure and chaste.
Wow.
And he, of course, as a young man, sees knights. He wants to be a knight. He wants to go on adventure. But he's very ill-equipped for this because his mother's kept him out of society and kept him from the evils that she perceives in society. And he goes on his travels, and there's a sort of famous scene where he comes across a tent-like bower, and there's a beautiful young lady in there, and he starts kissing her.
Wow.
He doesn't know he's not supposed to do that because he's not had any sexual education. He's been kept away from these things. He's been kept pure and chaste, and he actually risks being killed because people think he's going to rape her. I'm not sure he knows what rape is. And it's a very interesting situation because I think part of perhaps the situation here is actually the sexual education of women to stop them being so, shall we say, unprepared for predators.
Yeah.
That was my thought here.
Yeah,
Maybe it's fanciful.
Absolutely spectacular. And I do recall reading somewhere in my background readings when I was preparing, someone picks up on the name Percival as connecting to something. I don't remember any detail. There may be someone else. I'll look in my files afterwards, and if I find whoever it is who mentioned it, and this goes for everybody, by the way. The reason I gave my email address, many of you are already my friends, but anyone who's not already in contact with me, maybe Jeannie, post my contact info again now, if you would.
Sure.
And anyone who wants, I'll be happy to act as a clearinghouse to help anyone who reaches out to me to be in contact with anyone else here today about any of these topics, because that's really the benefit of this for me, is all this rich interaction that we're having now in the aftermath of it. That's what I love. And we're all going to be more knowledgeable by this pooling of knowledge together, right? So please reach out to me. And if you're in the United States, call me. I don't mind, or text me. And also check out my blog if you want to see more of my craziness than you've already heard briefly here today, because there's lots of it there about every one of Austen's writings and her biography and everything. So
I like the name of your blog. I believe it's the direct opposite of Such Dull Elves.
That's where I got it from, of course. Because if you look at that quotation from her letter that she's writing to Cassandra, jubilant for the publication of, not only the publication of Pride and Prejudice, but the reaction that it's getting already, the buzz among the literati she's already experiencing. And she writes playfully that, there are, like, and again, in her classic put on fashion, she's saying, well, there's a few common errors and a few he says and she says that are not clear. But she knows very well that there was nothing she was doing that was an error or was unclear. It was a game. And she's basically saying, I do not write for such dull elves, which is, after all, itself a sly rewriting of Scott's Marmion poem, a line in it about dull elves, is that she's all about all this subtext, all this underlying stuff. That's who she may write stories that work really well for people who don't go below the surface, but for those who do go below the surface, there's like this, it's like the scene in National Treasure when they finally open up the underground of the church on Wall Street and suddenly they find, thousands of years of stuff. That's what her novels are. They're like subterranean. It's like what Clara Toots said at the beginning. It's a closet stuffed with all this stuff. And we've only talked today about less than half, I'm going to say, of what's there. And Elaine will talk about more of it on Saturday. And then there's others. And this is a fragment, and it's something that wasn't even one of her published novels. That tells you why this is like an ocean to study, really. Sorry, I went on. But anyway, who else hasn't spoken? Who would like to say something?
There's many interesting items in the chat that we haven't talked about in the group. I'd like to just mention one.
Yes.
Stephanie, you mentioned that Jane's heroes tend to go on a learning journey and become a better version of themselves. And if Jane had rewritten Catherine, would she have given Catherine a journey? And then a couple other people hypothesize about where that journey would have been, to London with the Stanleys or elsewhere. I don't know if anybody or someone said, Elaine said, or to the lakes. So interesting how that character could have developed and maybe gotten a little bit more worldly wise.
Well, and I was also thinking that maybe she didn't have the same learning journey as maybe like Catherine Morland did, because she was kept imprisoned, so to speak. So I was just
you're right. That's the exact opposite
about that.
Actually, that plays back. It's wonderful, Stephanie, because it plays back to my suggestion that Northanger Abbey, in a way, was sort of like she jumped from Catharine to Northanger Abbey, and part of the reason would be she said, "Well, what if I do have my heroine not be confined in prison anymore, but be out in the world? What happens then?" And obviously, we see the result. It's wonderful.
There's a couple other interesting topics in here. One was, let's see, hold on. Oh, about the connection between, Marty had asked if there was a connection between the Lancaster and Tudor illegitimacy and illegitimate pregnancies. The Stanleys betrayed Richard III as this Stanley will betray Catherine.
Marty, can you elaborate on what you're getting
Well,
at there?
I was struck, especially since she wrote the history of England, that she definitely seemed to be not on the side of Queen Elizabeth and the Tudors. And Henry VII took, just like Henry IV took the throne from Richard II, Henry VII, who is, in my view, killed all kinds of heirs, is really more of a villain than Richard III. I'm not sure Richard III was a villain at all, but there were two examples of illegitimate monarchy, and Elizabeth is, of course, descended from Henry VII. And it just strikes me that there's a lot of sort of subtextual Shakespearean historical stuff that's going on underneath, especially with the name Stanley being a major name. Yeah. And yes. I got the feeling that he was, this whole thing with Catherine was as much to get her aunt stirred up as it was interest in her. And I have a feeling that he, unlike what his sister says, really isn't in love with her. And that, you know, if this were to go on, that he would be dumping her as Willoughby dumps Marianne. And, you know, I don't know what would happen, but I'm thinking that might be a reason why she didn't finish it either.
But she's an heiress, though. I mean, isn't it, I think it's implied that there, you know, Aunt Percival's a maiden aunt. There is nobody else to inherit her money. Yeah. So unlike Eleanor and Marianne, she has money. That would make her a target.
That's a good point.
And also the character of Edward Stanley, maybe we should focus on him for a couple of minutes, is that even though we get very little about him, this is very bizarre activity. He appears out of nowhere. He leaves out of nowhere. He's like a phantom. And I think that there's a suggestion, to me at least, I know I'm getting far into the gray, and that's why I have a gray background maybe, that maybe he did something, he's running away from something. He's like on the lam, and that's why he's in the continent, because he did something like Willoughby in a way. He knocked up someone, he did something, and he's got to be in France, but then he's coming back because the family's trying to maneuver. And remember, because we're only in Catherine's head, there could be all this intrigue going on that she has absolutely no idea about, and for that matter, her aunt may actually know something, but because she's busy thinking that her aunt's a pain in the ass, she's not listening to anything her aunt is saying, even something that might be valid, because maybe there's a history between the aunt and the Stanleys. You know, they go back a generation. There's all sorts of interesting possibilities. Lovely. Yeah. Anyone else?
Let me see.
And anybody who needs to leave, I won't be offended, but I'm loving this and I'll stay here a while longer as long as people want. So.
I had a quick question about,
go ahead.
In the text there was various capitalization. Is that in the manuscript? Is that like kind of a key for, you know, reading it out loud? Maybe like I heard that she would often read a lot of her stories out loud to her family as like an entertainment. Is that kind of what the capitalization was a tool for, or is that?
Someone else may know more than I do from studying more rigorously that point, but my impression is there's a lot of literature from that time that has capitalizations of words we wouldn't capitalize today at all. And it was just almost like a lot of nouns would get capitalized, maybe even verbs, I don't remember, just routinely. And maybe it's just, I have the impression it's just over time we have developed a rule of not doing that didn't exist then. But anyone know better than me about that? I don't know.
That's about right. Well, if you read manuscripts, often you can't tell the capitals from the lower, and yeah, a lot more words get capitalized.
Okay.
The language was, we can look back to Shakespeare and his original manuscript, and then to ours, you see the language is sort of heading, it seems to be heading in an arc of narrowing and precision of things that were used to be left open to wide degrees of freedom of different writers writing in different ways. Maybe it had something to do with their education, or maybe it was just okay to be quirky in your spelling. And she was certainly very quirky in her spelling, right? Which is odd because she was so well read, but for whatever reason, she would misspell words.
I think it's more of a concept of the rules for spelling and capitalization not having been formalized yet. It's a very common thing, like someone else said. I've been reading a lot of housekeeping manuals and recipe books from that same time period, and that's very typical of that. It's you spell it how you say it, which is kind of interesting. If you read out loud the way it's spelled, you can almost hear the cadences and the pronunciation and the accent of the person who wrote it.
Which is what Grant was suggesting, which is interesting. Yeah.
As to the capitalization, Arnie, you were correct in saying that it was very common at that time to capitalize an awful lot of nouns.
Yeah.
And for anybody who doesn't have access to manuscripts from that time, maybe the most accessible one you could get hold of would be the Declaration of Independence. And if you see what that was like in its original orthography, you'll find a lot of words there capitalized we wouldn't capitalize now.
Wonderful. And what did I want to say? In terms of the manuscript, there is a website, which I should have, now that I think of it, I should have given. But at the time I was giving, Marcia and I were putting together the materials to send out originally, it was, the website was down. But it's something I think a website that Catharine, Elaine, maybe you know about it, that Catharine Sutherland created. And I have a link for it where they actually have, for all of the juvenilia and also the Sanditon fragment and the Watson's fragment and sort of the peripheral writings of Jane Austen other than the novels, that they have manuscript images, facsimile images along, you can click a button and either read a transcription, including crossings out and stuff, or you can look and see the actual text of it. And that would be probably fascinating for anyone who wants to go deeper into Catharine, to just look at that and look at it page by page and see what she did.
I had one other question, this one more on the grammar, and I don't know if it was just kind of the grammar of that time, but at the end of the story, when Camilla was kind of quoting what Edward had told her as he left, she said, "For you was a nice girl," he said. Is that, like, was it supposed to be "for you were a nice girl," he said, or was correct grammar, or was correct at that time? Or?
It doesn't sound like anything I've ever seen. I mean, like Lucy Steele, for example, in Sense and Sensibility, will occasionally toss in a poor grammar moment here and there, and she's really smart. But I didn't notice what you're saying. I'm sure it's there, and that just sounds weird, like a mistake. It doesn't. I don't recall ever hearing that grammar error in anything I've read from that era before.
Probably a typo on the author's part. We had one other interesting comment in the chat, if I can find it here. Shoot, where is it? I lost it. Stephanie, you've mentioned that just talking about the Stanleys and how prolific that name was. There is an Elizabeth Stanley and an Anne Stanley in Line to the Throne, and a Shakespeare reference to William Stanley, the 6th Earl of Derby. So it was not, it was a very, it's sort of like Smith almost, that it's such a common name, but it's a common name in the aristocracy. I don't know if anybody else wanted to talk about that, or if Stephanie, you had any more information on that? She might have left.
I just did a quick Google search because I was just curious to see if there were any Stanleys that had anything to do with Queen Elizabeth's court, because how she just connects. Some of her names of people normally mean something. So I was just curious about that. And I saw a lot of things that came up. I've not gone deep, just like a few seconds. So I just threw that out there just to see if anyone else knew more. And I intend to look deeper later this afternoon.
And please follow up. And again, I will be happy to be a clearinghouse for anyone who wants to follow up on anything with any of the others who want to follow up. And we'll have sort of an ad hoc conversation in follow up to this, which would be really lovely. So I'd say let's leave another 15 minutes. It seems like things are slowing down, so I'm prepared to say another
Arnie,
15 minutes.
Arnie, I have to leave in a minute, but I just wanted to say it was a great talk.
Thank you.
I really appreciated it, but I also wanted to mention, go back to Grandison and the whole issue of childbirth. He never explicitly says, you know, abstain or whatever. He's very much about marriage, and he very much is about Charles Grandison sexually initiating Harriet. But there is this very strong strand of respect women that Austen would have responded to. Charles Grandison is absolutely explicit on the subject of primogeniture, that women should be given a piece of the property. Women should be made financially independent. Austen would have resonated with that very strongly. And I think as a solution to the sort of serial childbearing, Austen would very much have supported the idea of just respecting these women. You know, you don't have to have 11 children. You don't have to jump on these women, you know, 3 months after they've had the last baby and essentially maritally rape them. You can, you know, withstand the urge a little bit for the sake of these women. And I think Austen very much was on that page. And with that, I will say goodbye and thank you.
Wonderful.
I love the comments. I love the talk.
Thank you, Diane. Take care. So 15 more minutes, I say, and nobody has to stay 15 more, but I'll say I'll stay 15 more minutes. So any of you who are thinking, I'm enjoying this, but I don't want to stay here all afternoon. So 15 more minutes.
I have a question
Go ahead.
about whether Catherine was really an heiress. Why does she say to herself, why would he be seriously attached in the course of 4 and 20 hours to a girl who has nothing to recommend her but a good pair of eyes?
Oh boy, you're right. So she thinks I mean, that's her thoughts to herself, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so she doesn't think she has anything. Well, maybe part of the answer is sort of like Lady Denham in Sanditon, that she's got a rich aunt, but that doesn't automatically translate. The aunt can decide to favor someone else, right? Like Lady Denham in Sanditon has 5 different candidates to get her money, and she twirls them around on sticks around her. So maybe that's a way of reconciling them.
Well, that's worth looking into a little bit more.
She's a possible heiress, and that would also be relevant for him. But it would also fit with Aunt Percival partly, that she really wants to leave her wealth to Catherine, but on condition that she marries someone that she approves of, right? So it's like contingent. It's not automatic.
Good point.
Excellent.
I've got a comment here from Grant. He had to leave and he thanks you for the great event, but he says, the part I mentioned was, and in quotes, and he desired me when we all met at breakfast to give his compliments to your aunt and his love to you, for you was a nice girl, he said, and he only wished it were in his power to be more with you. And that's interesting. He uses the author uses the subjunctive there in the latter part of that sentence.
But it's Camilla reporting what what Edward said, and therefore she could have botched it herself. And her lack of education and her lack of being a reader would fit very much with her sort of misreporting his grammar.
But it seems strange. I think it's a typo because, you know, for you was a nice girl, but is obviously incorrect. But then right after that, she uses a much more complex part of speech, the subjunctive, not just the past tense. He only wished it were in his power. She'd be much more like, if Austen was trying to portray Camilla as being, you know, grammatically defective, she would have put was there as well. So I think it was just a written mistake.
Could be. After all, this wasn't a published novel. This was a manuscript where I know from experience, I will botch something when I'm rewriting something, and I hope I know the right answer, and I'll reread it later and say, how did I write that? So.
Why isn't it in his power to be more with you?
Well, he was sent away by the father, I guess, or it relates to.
I wonder if there's more to that, though.
Could be, right. It could be that he had to get out of Dodge quickly. He's a fugitive, you know. He, in a way, he's flitting here and there, and nobody knows quite where. His parents don't know when he's going to show up. Nobody knows. He's on the move. So, Jeannie, have we exhausted all the?
I'm looking through here to see if there's, yeah, there's a little bit more about Stanleys and illegitimate Lancasterians, but I think they're more like throwaway lines. And just see if anybody else has any comments. We're down to 25 attendees and a little bit after 3, so you might have worn everybody out.
I think I did. But again, I'm willing to stay another 5 or 10 minutes. But if nobody if we go a minute without anybody saying anything, then I think we're going to say we're done.
Well, as someone said earlier in the chat at the beginning, when you were in the midst of your presentation, someone commented, "You stunned us all into silence."
Well, remember what I said at the beginning. If I haven't said at least 3 things you didn't expect, you're not listening to me. Because and
good job.
I'll be honest though about something that confession. A month ago, I didn't understand what I think I understand that I expressed today in several important ways. I had gathered a lot of material. I had made a submission to I wrote a proposal to the AGM to give this talk at the AGM and was rejected. And so I never really developed my initial sense of these things going on that I had. And it's only under the panic of trying to actually put together an actual talk that people are going to hear me speak that it began to cause this weird alchemy to go on in my mind. So I had a version of this 3 weeks ago that is different, significantly different than what I wound up saying, because this business about the Northanger Abbey connection, I had truly never, I had seen that the first thing about Catharine that I ever noticed 15 years ago was this weird speech by her, and why is she talking about pregnancy? What the hell is this? But since in 2006, my understanding of Jane Austen was so primitive compared to what it is now that I had no frame of reference for understanding it beyond that she was making a nasty joke. But I never, ever came back to it to revisit it and then look at Northanger Abbey and think about how it relates. And at a certain point, it just clicked for me. And I said, of course, these are sister works, but that one is a sophisticated, full-blown artistic creation, Northanger Abbey, and the other is this proto thing that she dabbled with, but never really developed because she wasn't working on it as I think Northanger Abbey got finally revised in 1816, right? After she published Emma and before she started Sanditon. I think that's when we got the final wash on what became Northanger Abbey. And so every time she was revisiting her own work, it was getting better and more complex. And so, yeah. So I'm really, it's in a way, it's fortunate for me that there was this delay in giving this presentation because it gave me more time to figure out what the hell I wanted to say. So are we, yes.
I
Go
have
ahead,
a question.
Yes.
You were talking about the women having a cold, which was pregnancy. What about if a man had a cold? Or because in Sense and Sensibility, there's the reference of Colonel Brandon. Of course, he's wearing the flannel, all of that.
His
And
rheumatism and his flannel. Yeah.
Marianne says to her mother, I have an alarm on the subject of illness, which I cannot conceal from you. I am sure Edward Ferrars is not well. And then it goes on because it hadn't.
I do have an answer for you, and I'm glad you asked your question. Are you ready to be shocked again?
Oh, no.
Okay.
Syphilis. Syphilis. Mr. Woodhouse, look, even Jeannie can't understand it. Mr. Woodhouse, with his remembering of the riddle, which, if you're familiar with the riddle, that he only remembers one stanza of when they're looking at the charades with Emma and Harriet that came from Mr. Elton. And Mr. Woodhouse wanders in and says, what about Garrick's riddle? And he, Kitty, the fair but frozen, by the way, Kitty, the fair but frozen maid. It turns out that Kitty, the fair but frozen maid, in David Garrick's very salacious riddle from the middle of the 18th century, is about men, this thing that still goes on in the world today, horrifically, of men with venereal disease trying to cure themselves by having sex with virgins. Yeah. You've heard this horrible thing that still happens in the world.
Yeah.
That's what the subject matter of the second stanza, the one that he can't remember for the novel. It says when something strange bleeds. I mean, it's so gross. It's so ugly. And Jill Height Stevenson was the one who in 1999 first said, hey, this is what's going on in this riddle. Does that mean that Mr. Woodhouse has tertiary syphilis, which is why he would be not all there? And so Brandon, sure. If the shadow Brandon in Sense and Sensibility is a bad man. And so he's had a history that Eleanor and Marianne have. Marianne probably does know, but Eleanor doesn't. And if Eleanor doesn't know, we don't know. And so, yeah, that's a great question. That's my answer.
If that's the case, though, then why does Marianne we suppose, marry him later?
She does it for Eleanor. She does it so Eleanor can have Edward. It's a deal that is made. She's actually a martyr. It's upside down from the overt story. In the overt story, Marianne is selfish and has to be brought around to being a good person. In the shadow story, she's had a very difficult time of it, and she's actually taking care of Eleanor in the end and is sacrificing herself to bring family harmony and peace and financial stability to the family by marrying this ogre.
Gosh, yeah. I'm just envisioning Jane Austen appearing suddenly on this Zoom event and agreeing with you, Arnie. It's like, yes, that's exactly what I intended.
Can you arrange that? You have Zoom capacity. Say, why don't you create an avatar for Jane Austen to say this right now?
We'll work on that.
Oh, I wanted to see Colonel Brandon as a hero kind of guy.
But let me emphasize, Dula. I believe every one of the novels is two stories. So there is a Colonel Brandon. I'm not taking away your Colonel Brandon because in that world, he is the good guy you think he is. There's just another one, just like Darcy, just like Brandon, just like Knightley. There's a good one and there's a bad one. Because Jane Austen, in all seriousness, because I think Jane Austen was, as I read her mind, was saying, as a woman, you got to be prepared for either the ogre or the saint. But don't assume either one without evidence, because the evidence is ambiguous. She was trying to recreate an ambiguous world and then sort of tempt the reader into reading it romantically, reading it along with the heroine, but that she created another world and gave a million hints to it under the surface so that you could find them. And then if you found them, it'll destabilize the first reading. And then in the end, you go in a big circle and you say, they're both there. Can you hold two different stories in your mind at the same time? If you can do that, then you're ready to face the world.
Yeah.
Right?
And maybe she wants us to all think like Charlotte, the least we know about who we marry, the better, We could see that. Let's just look at the good side of the person we're married to and just stick with it.
Or as my wife, the clinical psychologist who specializes in couples the last 10 years especially, will say that it's love is about behavior. and you have to teach people how to behave in a loving way to each other, regardless of their feelings and whatever.
Yeah.
What it's all, and in a way, that's what Jane Austen is saying. You can make it work with a lot of people, a lot more people than you think, because after a while, that infatuation at the beginning, in many cases, goes away. But you can still have a marriage if you're willing to work at it and not have crazy expectations, because they're not realistic, right?
Yeah, behavior does matter. Behavior
I
does
think it's
matter.
fascinating that we've gotten so much out of this fragment of a novel that was written in, when was it written? 1892 or 1792?
1792, but then revised, in my opinion, clearly revised right before or even while she's getting published for the first time for real. So she's a mature woman when she's revising this. She's at 35 plus years old. And for her, given that she died at 41, that's mature Jane Austen as we're gonna get. Yeah, but I honestly didn't know when I started. I just had a feeling. I've learned over these years that when I have an intuition that there's something there, it's usually I will eventually find it if I stick with it. It's like doing a crossword puzzle. Eventually, I will get to something that sounds plausible, is not crazy, and I can back it up in some ways. And then I throw it out there and people do with it whatever they want.
So did Marianne lose the baby if she were pregnant?
We're talking about the baby that is born to the Palmers.
Oh my God.
with, I might add, an infection. So that's why Marianne almost dies at Cleveland, because she's this post-childbirth illness that affects, that's why they race away like crazy from her, because they're afraid that they want the baby to survive without the baby's mother.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were implying that Marianne was the true mother.
She is, but Mrs. Palmer takes the baby, just like Mrs. Weston takes Jane Fairfax's baby, just like Charlotte Lucas takes ? Baby. It's repeated over and over again in her novels.
Golly.
Kate, why don't you express your astonishment verbally?
Well,
but babies were born before.
I think this is brilliant. It's so good. I am going to go back and read everything again.
Uh-oh.
I'm just visiting today. I'm not a member anymore. I'm in Victoria, but you've re-inspired me. So thank you so much.
You will do a mitzvah if you join JASNA again, because Marcia wanted people to join JASNA from this kind of, this is a JASNA event. So join JASNA again, and I can tell her we got a new membership back.
And I'll have to tell my husband to get his costumes out, because the next time we can have a conference, we're going to come.
But you are going to attend next week, right? Or are you not? The AGM?
I hadn't thought about it, so
well, I think you may be too late.
It's too late now.
It might be too late,
unfortunately.
Yeah.
But for
Anyway.
$30 a year,
Yeah.
we've been doing all kinds of Zoom events, and we can share and jump into different regions. And boy, you can't get a better ticket to anything for $30.
Yeah. Well,
I
that's
agree.
great, Kate.
Thank
And I
you.
look forward maybe a year from now. Come to the next. Where's the next one? A year from now? I don't remember, but wherever it is.
Chicago.
Okay.
Yeah, Chicago 20, yeah.
See you in Chicago. Even though you're in Victoria, you're not that far from where I am now. So
No, Victoria. Okay, it's a deal.
Well, let's end it up then.
Arnie, just one last comment. I'm going to call you, I'm rewriting the title of your talk. I'm calling it Jane Noir.
I'm happy. You can put an asterisk next to it and give yourself credit for that wonderful name, because I never would have thought of that in a billion years. That's great. Thank you very much. Thank you all, especially those of you who have hung in for the whole time. This has made me so happy. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Well,
Arnie.
It's interesting.
Let's keep the conversation going about any loose ends after the fact. Give my email one last time, if you would.
Yep,
Jean,
yep.
And then we'll sign off. Or my
attention.
phone or my Twitter or anything. Or can you not find it?
Yeah, I got it. I got it right here. It just takes a second.
Okay.
Oops. Where is it? There we go.
Okay.
All right. You will be inundated, I'm sure, with hate mail. No, I didn't mean that.
No, there will be 2 or 3 people who will do it, but that'll be just great. Okay.
All right. Everybody got that? I'm going to close that out so we can say goodbye properly.
Yes. And thank you so much, Jeannie. You were an amazing, amazing steward of this event.
Wait a minute. I don't know how to get out of it. I'm stuck. I'm stuck in this mode.
We'll just say goodbye and sign
Say
out.
goodbye here.
Sounds great. Bye. Thanks, Jeannie.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for coming.
Bye. Thanks so much.
I can't get out of it. Stuck. Here we go. Here we go.